At exactly 1:17 in the afternoon on a slate-gray Thursday in late October, the front door of a small seaside restaurant in the Port District of Yeosu swung open too hard, and a man in a charcoal wool coat walked 3 steps inside before his knees folded beneath him like a chair someone had kicked. He did not fall the way drunks fell. Drunks fell loose. This man fell the way a marble statue falls, all at once in one heavy piece, and the sound his shoulder made against the varnished pine floor was a sound the other diners would later have trouble describing to the police, because it was not quite a thud and not quite a crack, but something between them, the way a frozen tree branch breaks in winter. For the length of one long breath, the restaurant did nothing. A retired schoolteacher near the window lowered her spoon into her stew and forgot to lift it out. A young father in the corner booth wrapped his hand around his daughter's wrist without knowing why. In the kitchen behind the pass, a rice pot hissed steam that no one turned down. Rain the color of pencil lead pressed itself against the glass and slid, and behind the counter, standing very still with a folded towel in her hands, a woman named Cho Yun-seo watched the fallen man's face turn the exact shade of paper her grandmother's hospital charts had been printed on, 11 years earlier, in a different city, on a different bad day. She recognized him before anyone said his name. She had spent 6 years teaching herself not to. The customers began to shout, the way people always did when their afternoon stopped being ordinary. Someone called for an ambulance. Someone else yelled that he was choking, though he was not. Her sous chef, a broad-shouldered man named Park who had left the Navy to cook, stepped out from behind the pass and looked at her the way a soldier looks at his commanding officer waiting for orders. Her waitress, barely 20, pressed both hands to her mouth and did not move. Yunseo set the towel down on the counter. She did it slowly, the way a person sets down a full glass they do not want to spill. She walked around the corner of the counter, past the tank of live abalone, past the small wooden shrine where her mother's photograph sat behind a thumb of incense, and she knelt beside the man on her polished floor as if he were any stranger the sea had washed in. She pressed 2 fingers against the side of his throat, just under the sharp line of his jaw, and she felt the slow, dragging kick of his pulse. A pulse that was not the pulse of a heart attack, or a stroke, or exhaustion. It was too even, too tired, too far away, a pulse that had been ordered to slow down and was obeying. She had seen this before, in a textbook, then in a courtroom exhibit, then in a photograph she was not supposed to have kept. Before you finish this cup of tea, or whatever it is you're holding while you listen, understand one thing about the woman kneeling on that floor. She was not saving him out of mercy, and she was not saving him out of love, and she was certainly not saving him out of forgiveness. She was saving him for a reason that would take another 6,000 heartbeats to explain, and if you leave now, you will never know what that reason was. So stay. This story only tells itself once. She turned his head to the side so he would not drown in his own throat. She loosened the silk knot at his collar with the same 2 fingers that had taken his pulse. She looked up at Park and said only, "The blue kit, under the sink." Park moved, the waitress did not. To the diners, Yunseo looked like a restaurant owner doing a good deed. To Park, who had known her for 3 years and still did not really know her, she looked like a different person entirely. A person who had done this before, in a place with worse lighting and no witnesses. She was 34 years old. She wore her hair in a low, practical braid and dressed in linen so plain that regular customers sometimes mistook her for the dishwasher. She had opened this restaurant, the Grey Gull, 4 winters ago with money no one in Yeosu could quite account for, and she had built its reputation slowly, on one dish at a time. A clear broth made from anchovy heads and green radish, seasoned with something her cooks were forbidden to ask about. Old men from the docks came for that broth on cold days and left with their eyes wet, and none of them could say exactly why. She had never told any of them her real name. The name on the restaurant's business license, Cho Yun-seo, was true enough for tax purposes, but it was not the name written on the birth certificate locked inside a safety deposit box in a bank 2 prefectures away. That name, the one she had been born with, the one her father had chosen for her the winter she came home from the hospital, wrapped in a blanket the color of persimmons. That name she had not spoken aloud in 6 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She had, however, whispered it once, in the dark, into the wooden slats of a boat that was carrying her across the Yellow Sea, on the night she had decided not to die. Park returned with the blue kit. Yoon Seo opened it on the floor beside the fallen man, and her hands moved through its contents the way a pianist's hands move through a scale. Atropine, a syringe of activated charcoal suspension, a small unmarked vial she had prepared herself, and which no ordinary restaurant kitchen had any business owning. She did not use the unmarked vial, not yet. She drew the atropine, checked the dose against the man's weight. She had guessed it at 81 kilograms, and she was off by less than half a kilogram, and she pushed the needle into the muscle above his collarbone. The waitress made a small, involuntary noise. "Turn the sign," Yoon Seo said, without looking up. Her voice was so quiet the waitress had to lean forward to hear her. "Closed, now, and ask everyone to please finish their meals at home, on the house." The customers, who had been standing in the middle of their own noise, went suddenly obedient the way frightened people do when someone else in the room refuses to be frightened. They gathered coats, they left $1 on their tables that Yoon Seo would later fold without counting and drop into the tip jar. They filed out under the small brass bell above the door, and the bell rang 11 times, and Yoon Seo counted every ring without meaning to, because counting was what she did when she could not afford to feel. By the time the ambulance arrived at 1:29, 12 minutes after the man had walked in, and 8 minutes after she had put the atropine into him, his pulse had climbed from 38 to 52, and his eyelids had begun to twitch in the small, involuntary way that meant the paralysis was losing its grip and he could hear them, even if he could not yet answer. She rode with him. She told the paramedics her name was Kim Soo-ae, which was the name printed on the second identification card she carried in a hidden pocket, sewn inside her apron. She told them she was his cousin. She told them he had been at her restaurant for lunch and had simply collapsed. She did not tell them that when she had loosened his collar, she had seen the small, fresh puncture mark on the inside of his left wrist, no larger than the bite of a mosquito, and that the skin around it was already the pale blue-green of an old bruise. She had seen that color before, too. At the hospital in central Yeosu, she paid the emergency deposit in cash from an envelope she kept in the inner lining of her coat for emergencies she had rehearsed but never quite believed would arrive. She signed the intake papers as Kim Soo-ae. She waited in the corridor outside the intensive care unit for exactly 47 minutes until a nurse came out and told her that the patient was stable, that whatever he had ingested was being flushed, and that he would live. Yoon Seo thanked her. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the ground floor. Between the 4th floor and the 3rd, she leaned her forehead against the cold steel wall of the elevator and let out one long, shuddering breath she had been holding since the moment his knees had folded on her floor. Then she straightened her collar, walked out through the lobby, past a security camera she had already noted the angle of, and disappeared into the rain. The man's name was Yoon Jae-won, and by the following morning, when he woke in a private room on the 11th floor of a hospital, his organization had quietly bought out for the day. He was the most powerful man in the country who did not know who had saved his life. He was 41 years old. He had inherited a construction and shipping conglomerate from his father at the age of 29, and by 31, he had turned its below-the-books operations into what the National Police Agency's Organized Crime Bureau internally referred to, in memoranda that never left the building, as the largest single criminal architecture on the peninsula. He did not call himself a boss. He called himself a chairman. The distinction mattered to him in ways he could not have explained. He had been poisoned at a private lunch the previous afternoon by a glass of chilled plum wine served to him in a crystal cup he had drunk from 100 times before. He had recognized the wrongness of the taste on the second sip, a faint metallic sweetness like sucking a copper coin, and had, on pure instinct, excused himself from the table, walked out to his car, driven himself for 8 kilometers along the coast road because he did not trust his driver, and stumbled into the first lit doorway he saw before his legs stopped obeying him. He had not chosen the restaurant. He had not even seen its name. When he woke, his second-in-command was standing at the foot of the bed, and his personal physician was at his left elbow, and 3 of his lawyers were seated against the far wall with their briefcases closed on their knees. His younger cousin, Chairman Ha, the silver-haired advisor who had been his father's closest friend and who had, for the last 12 years, been the closest thing Jae-won had to a father himself, stood by the window with his hands folded behind his back, looking out at the sea. The first question Jaewon asked, in a voice like torn silk, was not who had done this to him. The first question was, "Who brought me in?" No one had an answer. The hospital's records listed a woman named Kim Soo-ae. The name matched no citizen in the National Registry. The security camera in the emergency bay had, according to the hospital's technicians, suffered a corruption of its overnight storage that no one could explain. The camera in the elevator had captured only the back of a woman's head and the collar of a rain-dark coat. The paramedics remembered her hands more than her face. Steady hands, unusually steady, with a small pale scar shaped like a comma at the base of her left thumb. Jaewon closed his eyes and, for the first time in 11 years, saw a scar he had once traced with his own thumb, in a car parked outside a jazz club in Itaewon, at 3 in the morning, in a life he had convinced himself had never really happened to him. He said nothing. He did not open his eyes for a long time. Chairman Ha at the window said gently, "You should rest, Jaewon-ah. We will find her. It is only a matter of time." Jaewon opened his eyes and looked at the old man's back and thought, for reasons he could not yet name, that Ha's shoulders were held 1 degree too still. Down the coast, at exactly 6:03 in the evening of that same Thursday, Yunseo unlocked the back door of the Grey Gull, stepped into her own kitchen, and stood for a full minute with her forehead pressed against the cold stainless steel of the walk-in refrigerator, listening to it hum. Park was waiting for her at the pass. He had cleaned the floor. He had not asked her a single question. He set a small cup of barley tea in front of her without a word, and she wrapped both hands around it and drank it in 3 swallows, and then she looked at him and said, "If anyone comes asking, I was at the market until 3. You saw me buy monkfish." Park nodded. "How much monkfish?" "2, small ones." "Cash?" "Cash." He turned back to his cutting board and began breaking down a red snapper as though nothing had happened, and Yunseo felt, for the second time that day, the sting of a gratitude she could not repay. She went upstairs to the small apartment above the restaurant. She took off her wet clothes. She took a long, punishingly hot shower. She sat on the edge of her bed in a white cotton robe, and from the bottom drawer of her dresser, beneath a folded stack of winter sweaters, she pulled out a black lacquered box the size of a paperback book. Inside the box lay a single object, a photograph cut down to fit of a young man in a graduation gown standing between a smiling girl in a white dress and an older man in a gray suit. The girl was 17. The young man was 23. The older man had his hand on the young man's shoulder in the easy, proud way of a father who has already forgiven his son for everything he has not yet done. Yunseo looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she closed the box, put it back under the sweaters, and lay down on top of the covers with her eyes open, and did not sleep. The next day, and the day after, and the day after that, Jaewon's men swept through every business within a 2-kilometer radius of the alley where his car had been found. They spoke to shopkeepers. They spoke to fishmongers. They spoke to old women who ran laundromats and old men who ran tobacco stalls. They asked, always politely, always with the small envelope of cash pressed into the palm, whether anyone had seen a tall man in a charcoal coat on the afternoon of the 23rd. At the Grey Gull, they were told by a broad-shouldered sous chef named Park that no such man had been seen, that the restaurant had closed early that day for a plumbing issue, and that the owner, Cho Yun-seo, had been at the fish market until 3. Park said this while breaking down a red snapper. He did not look up. The men left the envelope on the counter anyway, out of habit, and Park set it aside without touching it, and later, when they were gone, walked it down to the harbor and dropped it into a collection box for the families of fishermen lost at sea. On the 4th day, Jaewon discharged himself from the hospital against the advice of every physician on the payroll. On the 5th day, he sat in the back of a black sedan and had his driver take him. Slowly, along the coast road, he half remembered driving in a haze of poison. He watched the storefronts pass, a pharmacy, a shop selling knitted goods, a small restaurant with a hand-painted sign of a gray seabird on a slate blue background. He told the driver to stop. He got out of the car in the thin autumn sunshine, and he stood on the wet pavement looking up at the sign, and something inside his chest did the small, unreliable thing it had not done in 11 years. A kind of sideways lurch, as though the ground beneath his shoes had briefly tilted, and only he could feel it. He walked in alone. He told his men to wait. The brass bell above the door rang once. A young waitress looked up from folding napkins and froze. In the kitchen, a broad-shouldered cook set down his knife very carefully on the cutting board and did not pick it up again. Behind the counter, arranging small white bowls of pickled radish on a wooden tray, a woman in a linen apron looked up, and for one long second, the whole restaurant held its breath, because two people who had spent 6 years believing the other was either lost or unforgivable were now standing 8 meters apart in a room that smelled of anchovy broth and rain-damp wood. She did not drop the bowl she was holding. He noticed that first, in the version of her he had carried inside himself for 6 years, the version his own men had briefed him on, the version the fabricated evidence had painted. She had been a woman who dropped things, a woman whose hands shook, a woman who cried. This woman's hands were entirely still. He said her name. He said the real one, the one on the birth certificate in the safety deposit box, the one she had not heard from another human mouth in 6 years, 3 months, and 15 days. She set the bowl down on the tray. She wiped her hands on the front of her apron. She looked at him with an expression so calm it took him a moment to understand that calm was the worst thing her face could have done to him. Worse than screaming, worse than weeping, worse than a knife. "That's not the name over the door," she said. He took a step toward the counter. She did not move. "I came to thank you," he said. His voice was not the voice of the chairman of anything. It was the voice of a man who had been drinking cold water for a week and could still taste copper. "You don't owe me thanks," she said. "You owe me nothing. Please don't come back." He stayed where he was. Behind him, through the front window, his 2 bodyguards were visible on the sidewalk, pretending to look at their phones. Park, in the kitchen, had picked the knife back up and was holding it, blade down, along the seam of his thigh, in the way he had been taught in the Navy to hold a knife, when he did not yet want anyone to know he was holding it. Jaewon saw none of that. He was only looking at her hands. "I didn't know," he said. His voice cracked in the middle of the second word, and he did not try to smooth it. "Yun, I didn't know." "You didn't ask," she said. That was the sentence that stayed with him. That was the sentence he would repeat to himself in the back of the sedan, in his study, in the shower, in the small hours of every night for the next 3 weeks. "Not you destroyed my family. Not you burned my father's warehouse. Not you had me declared a traitor in a room I was not allowed to enter. Just, you didn't ask." He walked back out of the restaurant. The bell rang once behind him. On the sidewalk, one of his bodyguards said, "Chairman," and Jaewon walked past him without answering and got into the car and told the driver to go, and did not say another word for the rest of the day. That night, in his study, on the top floor of a house on a hill above the harbor, he opened a locked drawer he had not opened in 6 years and took out a file the thickness of a small book. It was the file that had, in a single afternoon in a room full of men in dark suits, ended the life he might have had. Bank records, phone logs, grainy photographs of a young woman meeting men whose faces he had been told were rival intelligence officers. A confession, initialed on every page, that she had never in fact signed. He read the file all the way through, for the first time, not the summary, the whole thing. He read it the way a doctor reads an autopsy of someone he loved. By 4 a.m, he had found the first inconsistency. A phone call, time-stamped 11:14 p.m. on a Thursday, from a number the file identified as hers. He remembered where he had been that Thursday night. He remembered because she had been beside him, sleeping with one hand tucked under her cheek and a small scar shaped like a comma showing at the base of her thumb. She had not made that call. She could not have, which meant someone else had, which meant the file was not evidence. The file was a story, and every story had an author. He looked up from the pages and out through his window at the black water of the harbor, and for the first time in his adult life, Yoon Jae-won understood with the cold clarity of a man understanding his own diagnosis that the monster in the story he had been living inside for 6 years had been himself. Meanwhile, in a village 200 kilometers north, in a small wooden house set back from a road that wound between rice paddies, a man in his late 50s who was legally dead sat at a low table drinking barley tea and reading a coded message on a burner phone. The message was 3 lines long. It contained, among other things, the phrase, "Gray Gull," the name Yoon Jae-won, and a single Korean character that meant, in the old military code the man had used 40 years earlier, accelerate. The man set the phone down. He walked to the window. He looked out at his rice paddies, brown and cut short for the season, and he thought about his daughter for the first time in 11 days, which was as long as he had trained himself to go. Her name was not Cho Yoon-seo. It had never been Cho Yoon-seo, the name he had chosen for her. The winter he brought her home from the hospital wrapped in a persimmon-colored blanket had been something else entirely, something he had not permitted himself to speak aloud since the day he faked his own death, 6 years ago, in a car fire on a mountain road outside Wonju, because he had discovered, 3 months before that fire, that the criminal organization he had spent his life quietly financing was not, in fact, being run by the men whose names appeared on its ledgers. It was being run by people whose names appeared nowhere at all, people who had, when they realized he had discovered them, tried to kill him. People who, when they failed to kill him, had done something worse. They had used their reach inside Yoon Jae-won's organization through a silver-haired advisor named Chairman Ha, who had been on their payroll since 1997, to fabricate the evidence that turned Jae-won against his daughter, so that whatever alliance her marriage into that family might have created would never come to be, because together, the two of them, the daughter of a hidden financier and the heir to the peninsula's largest criminal architecture, would have been a problem no invisible network could afford. The man at the window drank the last of his barley tea. He set the cup down. He picked up the phone again and typed a single character back, which meant, in the same old code, coming. Then he went to the closet in his bedroom and took out a coat he had not worn in 6 years. Over the next 11 days, everything Yoon Jae-won had ever believed about his own life came apart in his hands. He began quietly because he did not yet know who inside his own organization he could trust. He pulled financial records himself in the middle of the night from a laptop he had bought in a market and paid for in cash. He compared timestamps. He cross-referenced phone logs against travel itineraries he'd kept in his own handwritten journals. He found, one after another, the small impossibilities that had been hidden inside the file for 6 years. A call placed from a phone in a city she had never been to. A bank transfer signed by a hand that was not her hand. A photograph taken at an angle that no camera in that hotel corridor could have achieved. Every impossibility pointed, when he followed it, toward the same silver-haired man who had stood at the window of his hospital room and said gently, "We will find her." He did not confront Chairman Ha. Not yet. He watched him instead. He watched him the way a hunter watches a deer that does not yet know it has been seen. And while he watched, other things began to happen. A warehouse on the outskirts of Incheon burned in the middle of the night, and 3 of his oldest captains died inside it, and the police called it an electrical fire. A lawyer who had worked for his family for 20 years drove off a bridge in clear weather. A retired detective who had, 6 years earlier, quietly refused to sign off on the file against Yoon Seo was found in his apartment with an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside him, and a suicide note in handwriting that his widow swore, weeping, was not his. Every one of the dead had, at some point in the last 6 years, been in a room where Yun Seo's name had been spoken aloud. Someone was not attacking Jae-won's empire. Someone was erasing witnesses. Yun Seo, in her small apartment above the restaurant, saw the pattern before he did. She had, over the last 6 years, built something she had never told anyone about. Not Park, not the waitress, not the old men who came for the anchovy broth. Under the name Kim Soo-ae and 2 other names besides, she had quietly become one of the most cited forensic financial analysts in the country, submitting her reports through a shell consultancy registered in Singapore, testifying in 3 prosecutions by video link with her face pixelated and her voice modulated, and never, not once, meeting any of her clients in person. She had not done it for revenge. She had told herself that, over and over, in the small hours of 6 years of nights. She had done it because when the life you were promised is taken from you, you have to build something with your hands, or the hands themselves stop working. But now, with the names of the dead scrolling across a private database she had access to through a firm in Zurich, she understood, with the same cold clarity Jae-won had felt in his study, that the past she had tried to bury was not, in fact, buried. It had only been waiting for her to look away. She began quietly to gather. She reached out through channels that took days to open to the retired detective's widow. She reached out to the family of the lawyer who had gone off the bridge. She reached out most carefully of all to a woman who had been a junior secretary in Chairman Ha's office 14 years earlier, and had left, without explanation, 3 days after seeing something on a fax machine she was not supposed to see. The junior secretary, now a grandmother running a small flower shop in Daegu, agreed to meet. They met on a bench outside a temple in the hills above the city, on a morning so cold their breath came out in gray plumes. The grandmother handed Yun Seo a small brown envelope. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of thermal fax paper, so old the ink had begun to fade into ghosts. But the ghosts were still legible. It was an internal memorandum, dated 6 years and 2 months earlier, addressed to Chairman Ha from a name Yun Seo had never heard before, at an address in a country she had only visited once. It contained, in careful bureaucratic language, a request for confirmation that a certain marriage, hers to Jae-won, had been prevented, and a schedule of payments to be released upon such confirmation. At the bottom of the memorandum, in a small hand, someone had written a single note in blue ink: "The financier's daughter must never be allowed to inherit." Yun Seo read the sentence 3 times. Her breath, which had been coming out in gray plumes, stopped coming out at all. She folded the fax carefully in half, then in quarters, and put it inside the inner lining of her coat, in the same hidden pocket where she kept the envelope of emergency cash. The financier's daughter. She had not been called that in her own head, in her own life, since she was 17 years old, and her father had sat her down at the low table in their kitchen and told her, in a voice she had never heard him use before, that everything she thought she knew about her family was true and also incomplete, and that when she was old enough to hear the rest, he would tell her. He had died before he could tell her, or so she had believed. The grandmother on the bench watched her face and said quietly, "There is one more thing." Yun Seo looked up. "Your father," the old woman said. "The car fire. I was told by a man who had reason to know that the body they pulled out of that car was already dead when it went in. Someone else's body. Your father. I do not know where your father is, child, but he did not die on that mountain." The wind moved through the pine trees above them. Somewhere down in the city, a bell rang for the noon hour. Yun Seo felt, very distinctly, the small, pale, comma-shaped scar at the base of her left thumb begin to itch, the way it had itched every winter of her life. Since the day at 7 years old when she had cut it climbing over the wall of her father's garden. And he had held her wrist under the cold water of the garden tap and told her that scars were the places where the body remembered what the mind was allowed to forget. She said, in a voice that did not sound like hers, "Thank you." The old woman nodded. They sat for a while longer on the cold bench, and then Yun Seo stood up and walked back down the hill toward the city. And she understood, with the same clarity that had come to Jae-won in his study, that the story she had been living inside for 6 years had never been her story at all. She had only been a chapter in someone else's book. She and Jae-won met for the second time on the 11th evening after his visit to the restaurant, in the empty upstairs room of a tea house, in a district neither of them had ever been to before. She chose the location. He came alone. He came at her instruction, without a phone, without a wallet, and without the silver watch his father had given him at 21, which he had worn every day since, and which she had correctly guessed was tracked. She laid the fabricated file across the low table on one side. She laid her own file, 6 years of quiet, patient forensic accounting, across the other. Between them, she placed the folded facts. He read for 2 hours without speaking. When he finished, he sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes closed, and she watched a single tear slide down the side of his nose and land on the back of his own wrist, and he did not wipe it away. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About, 11 days. About the network?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My whole life, I think. In pieces, without knowing what the pieces were." He opened his eyes. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the shore. "What do you want me to do?" he said. She did not answer immediately. She poured him a small cup of tea, and she poured herself one, and she took a sip of hers before she spoke, because she had learned over 6 years that the words that mattered most were the ones you did not rush. "I don't want you to do anything for me," she said. "I stopped wanting that a long time ago. But there are dead men whose families deserve to know why. There is a country whose courts deserve to see what is in these pages. And there is an old man in your house who thinks he has been the smartest person in every room he has ever walked into. And he has been wrong about that for at least 14 years. I am going to prove all 3 of those things, whether you help me or not." Jae-won looked at her for a long time. "And after?" he said. "After what?" "After it's done. After the network, after all of it." She set her cup down. She looked past him, out the small window of the tea house, at a lantern in the alley that was swinging very slightly in the wind. "I don't know," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I know. I'm not going to promise you anything. I saved your life because letting you die on my floor would have meant that they won without ever having to lift another hand. And I was not willing to give them that. I didn't save you because I forgave you. I have not forgiven you. I am not sure I ever will. But I am also not going to spend the rest of my life carrying what you did to me around like a stone in my pocket, because that would mean they get to keep hurting me forever, using your hands. And I am done being hurt by anyone's hands, including my own." He nodded once. He did not try to touch her. "Then tell me what to do," he said. She told him. What happened over the next 4 months would, in the years to come, be reported in the country's newspapers under 3 different names, in 5 different frames, and with a number of increasingly imaginative theories about who had really been behind it. None of them would be entirely correct. None of them would name her at all. Chairman Ha was arrested at his own breakfast table on a Sunday morning in February by prosecutors carrying evidence bound in 3 ring binders that they had received anonymously through a chain of custody that ended at a shell consultancy in Singapore. He did not resist. He asked quietly to be allowed to finish his coffee. The lead prosecutor, a woman in her 40s who had been passed over for promotion 4 times, allowed it. The invisible network above him, the one whose name Yoon Seo's father had discovered 40 years earlier and paid for with the fiction of his own death, was not destroyed. Networks of that kind are never destroyed. They are only interrupted. But it was interrupted badly enough and publicly enough that 3 governments began quiet inquiries, and 2 of them produced actual indictments, and 1 of them produced a small change in banking law that would, in the decades to come, make the particular architecture of the network's control significantly harder to rebuild. Yoon Jae-won's organization did not survive. He did not try to save it. He handed over, one by one, through lawyers whose names he trusted, only because Yoon Seo had vetted them, every ledger, every account, every warehouse, every name. Some of his own men went to prison, some of them did not. He himself was charged eventually with a smaller set of crimes than he had actually committed, because the prosecutors could not prove the larger ones without exposing witnesses they had promised to protect. He served 2 years in a minimum security facility outside Cheongju. He did not appeal. Kang Min-seok, the younger cousin Yoon Seo, eventually identified as the true architect of the poisoning, a man who had spent a decade believing he was protecting his family from the invisible network by taking it over himself, and who had done terrible things in the service of that belief, was found on the morning of Jae-won's release in the abandoned upper floor of a seaside hotel where he had gone to wait for a meeting that would never come. He had left a letter. In the letter, he apologized to his brother for reasons the brother would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. He did not apologize to anyone else. Yoon Seo's father came home in the third month, quietly on a bus. He walked up the alley behind the gray gull carrying a small canvas bag. Park, at the pass, saw him first and set his knife down for the second time in 6 months and went upstairs to knock on Yoon Seo's door. When she opened the door and saw the old man standing behind Park in the hallway, with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes wet, she did not run to him. She walked, slowly, all the way down the hall. And she put her forehead against his shoulder without a word, and stood there for a long time, and the small pale scar at the base of her left thumb pressed against the rough weave of his coat, and remembered. On a Thursday afternoon in late March, at exactly 1:17, the brass bell above the door of the Grey Gull rang once, and a man in a plain dark coat walked in and sat down at the small corner table by the window. He was thinner than he had been the last time he sat in that district. His hair had gone gray at the temples in a way that had not been there before. He carried no watch on his wrist. He carried no phone in his pocket. He did not look at the woman behind the counter, and she did not look at him. The waitress, older now and steadier, brought him a small paper menu. He did not open it. "A bowl of the anchovy broth," he said, "please." The waitress nodded and turned and looked at the woman behind the counter, and the woman behind the counter nodded once, and Park in the kitchen began to ladle the broth into a bowl. Yoon Seo carried it out herself. She set it down in front of him. She set down a small dish of pickled radish beside it. She set down a spoon. She did not sit. She did not speak. He looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and for the length of one long breath the whole restaurant held very still, because two people who had spent 7 years learning how to survive the wreckage of each other were standing 8 inches apart in a room that smelled of anchovy broth and rain-damp wood, and neither of them yet knew what came next. Outside the window, the sea moved the way the sea always moved, indifferent to the small human weather inside the glass. She did not smile. He did not either. But when she turned to go back to the counter, her hand brushed very lightly the sleeve of his coat, in a way that could have been an accident and was not. And on his sleeve, when she looked at her own hand a moment later, there was a single strand of her hair, dark against the dark wool, and he did not brush it off. He picked up the spoon. He tasted the broth. He closed his eyes. Behind the counter, above the small wooden shrine where her mother's photograph sat, Yoon Seo had, 3 weeks earlier, quietly placed a second photograph, smaller, in a plain wooden frame, of an old man in a gray coat standing in a rice paddy in early spring, with his hand raised in a small, familiar wave. Some wounds heal, some simply stop bleeding. And some, if you are patient enough and honest enough and willing to sit at the same table again after everything, become the exact shape of the door through which the rest of your life is finally allowed to walk. If this story stayed with you, if you felt at any point the particular ache of watching two people learn that forgiveness and trust are not the same word, and that either one of them, given time, is worth more than revenge, then pass it along to the one person in your life who has been waiting quietly longer than they should have had to. Stories like hers are not rare. They are only rarely told. And there are more of them, waiting on this channel for the next quiet Thursday afternoon you decide to sit down and listen.